Before 1972, the North Fork of the Clearwater River in north-central Idaho held what biologists called the finest population of large-sized steelhead in the world. B-run steelhead averaged 16 pounds, some topping 30 pounds, and that they returned in runs of 20,000 or more. The North Fork produced 90% of the Clearwater Basin's native B-run fish. In 1962, nearly 43,200 wild B-run steelhead were counted at a dam just 3 miles from the Snake River confluence. The Nez Perce people had fished these waters for more than 16,000 years. The town of Osaka was the largest inland native fishing village in the Pacific Northwest. Then someone built a 717-foot concrete wall across the river. There was no fish ladder, no way past. By 2017, fewer than 400 wild B-run steelhead returned to the entire Clearwater Basin. That was a decline of 99.9%. That wall is Dworshak Dam. Steelhead of the North Fork Clearwater were giants in every sense. Biologists called them B-run, fish that spent extra winters in the Pacific, returning upstream as broad-shouldered adults, thick as a man's thigh, some stretching to 44 inches and tipping the scale past 30 pounds. Most weighed at least 16 pounds, and every autumn, tens of thousands surged back from the ocean, tracing the cold, fast water up from the Snake. In 1962, state records counted 43,200 wild B-run steelhead, passing a single checkpoint just miles from the river's mouth. The North Fork alone produced nearly all the Clearwater Basin's native B-run, population unrivaled anywhere in the Columbia system. For the Nez Perce, these fish were more than food. They were the river's promise, woven into stories, ceremonies, and the rhythm of life at Osaka, the largest inland fishing village in the Northwest. Every return was a renewal, a gathering of families on gravel bars now lost beneath still water. The scale of what once lived here, thousands of immense steelhead year after year, defies easy imagination. Yet for centuries it was simply the way of the river. In the spring of 1948, the Columbia and Clearwater rivers surged beyond memory. Snowmelt and relentless rain pushed water to record heights, swallowing towns, farms and rail lines from the Idaho border to the Pacific. At its peak, the Columbia roared at over 110,000 cubic feet per second in places, flattening entire neighborhoods in Vanport and sending shockwaves through the Northwest. The damage was staggering. By summer's end, losses topped $1 billion, a figure unmatched by any flood in the region's history. Federal engineers from the Army Corps arrived with notebooks and survey rods, charting high watermarks and searching for answers. Their reports called for control, concrete, spillways and storage before the next deluge could strike. The North Fork Clearwater, with its narrow basalt gorge at Bruce's Eddy, drew their attention as an ideal site for a massive dam. The urgency was clear. Without new defences, another flood could erase even more. In the aftermath, the push for action swept aside questions of what might be lost in the process. Senator Henry Dworshak wasted little time after the 1948 flood. In 1949, he secured $2.5 million in federal appropriation, an unusual move for a project not yet authorised by Congress. This early funding allowed the Army Corps of Engineers to launch detailed surveys and engineering studies at Bruce's Eddy, years before the dam had any formal approval. The congressional record from that year describes the manoeuvre as unprecedented, signalling a deep federal commitment that would be hard to reverse. While debate simmered in local newspapers and among conservation groups, the project quietly advanced on the federal agenda. By the time the Flood Control Act of 1962 formally authorised construction, the groundwork was already in place. The Act cited public safety and regional development as its main goals, earmarking money for both flood control and hydropower. Yet tucked into its language was only a brief mention of fish passage, a promise that, as events would show, carried little weight against the momentum of concrete and politics. With funding secured and the Corps mobilised, the path toward building one of the tallest straight-axis concrete dams in North America was set. Arguments over the future of the North Fork Clearwater sharpened as the dam moved from blueprint to reality. Conservationists like Mort Brigham of the Lewis Clark Wildlife Club stood before packed hearings, warning that the project was nothing less than a death warrant for North Fork wildlife. He spoke not just for anglers, but for a river system whose fate would be decided by men in distant offices. The Oregon Fish Commission, backed by its own biologists, submitted memos predicting that the dam's promised cold water releases could never replace the loss of more than 1,000 miles of spawning grounds. Their projections showed that even the largest hatchery could not sustain wild steelhead runs if the river itself was severed. Yet on the other side, boosters and federal engineers promised flood protection, clean power, and a new era of regional growth. In official statements, the Army Corps of Engineers downplayed ecological warnings, assuring the public that modern science would keep the river's legacy alive. As the debate raged, the question was no longer whether something would be lost, but how much, and who would bear the cost. With ground not yet broken, the battle lines were drawn and the river's defenders found themselves outnumbered by the machinery of progress. Concrete began to flow at Bruce's Eddy on June 6, 1968. What started as a plan for a modest barrier soon became an obsession with height and permanence. Engineers revised their blueprints again and again, first 370 feet, then 570, then 630. By the time the final design was approved, the wall would rise to 717 feet, making it one of the tallest straight-axis concrete dams in North America. To reach that scale, work crews poured 6.6 million cubic yards of concrete, enough to pave a 2-lane highway from Idaho to the Pacific. The site ran around the clock, floodlights turning night into day, while trucks and cranes ferried aggregate and cement across the gorge. Each new lift of the wall buried another piece of the old river, another memory of the North Fork's wild course. The dam's shadow grew longer with every month, and so did the toll. By the time the topping out ceremony was held in January 1973, 8 workers had lost their lives to falls, crushing equipment, or the relentless hazards of construction. The structure they left behind was absolute. No fish ladder, no passage, only concrete from bedrock to sky. When the last bucket of concrete was poured, the wall at Bruce's Eddy stood unbroken, no ladder, no ramp, no route for fish. Internal memos from the Army Corps of Engineers laid out the logic. At 717 feet, Dworshak was simply too tall for any known fish passage technology. The cost of a ladder or elevator, estimated at up to $35 million, was judged prohibitive. Instead, the Corps turned to a different solution, a hatchery built from the ground up to manufacture the future of the North Fork's steelhead. In April 1969, the Dworshak National Fish Hatchery opened its gates, a $21 million complex of raceways and rearing tanks designed to release 3.4 million juvenile fish each year. The promise was clear: if the river itself could not be restored, then biology would be engineered in its place. But the decision came with a stark consequence. The dam cut off 1,667 miles of spawning habitat, sealing off every tributary above the reservoir. For the wild steelhead, the North Fork became a dead end, its legacy now filtered through concrete channels and the cold logic of mitigation. The landscape, once defined by migration, was redefined by containment. When the reservoir gates closed, the North Fork's wild corridor disappeared beneath a lake stretching 54 miles into the Idaho mountains. Nearly 17,000 acres of forest, meadow, and riverbank, habitat that once fed elk, deer, and black bear, vanished under 3.47 million acre-feet of stored water. The river's pulse slowed, replaced by a cold, stratified expanse where native fish could no longer spawn. In 1980, a 236-foot vertical crack split the dam's downstream face, forcing emergency repairs and raising doubts about the permanence of concrete. To keep the new lake alive, the Corps began dosing it with fertilizer, towing nutrients across the surface to spark life in water that no longer flowed. For the Nez Perce, the closure of the North Fork was not just an ecological loss, but a breach of promises written into the 1855 treaty. Nakia Williamson, speaking for his people, described a world where fishing at Osaka was more than survival. It was the heartbeat of culture, ceremony, and memory. When the river was dammed, thousands of years of tradition were drowned, along with the gravel bars and fishing camps. Today, the tribe's fisheries department operates with 200 staff and a $20 million budget, releasing nearly 10 million fish each year in an effort to restore what was taken. Yet the numbers cannot replace the lived connection to place. In 2020, the Nez Perce filed a federal lawsuit, arguing that the loss of the steelhead run is not just a statistic, but a violation of their rights and a wound that still has not healed. Floodwaters that once swept through towns now pause behind concrete. Since 1972, the US Army Corps of Engineers credits Dworshak Dam with sparing downstream communities more than $2.8 billion in flood damages. Each year, its turbines generate 1.69 billion kilowatt hours of electricity, enough for nearly 150,000 homes. Cold water releases cool the lower Snake River, giving migrating salmon and steelhead a fighting chance during the hottest weeks. The reservoir draws over 100,000 visitors annually, fueling local tourism and recreation. But the other side of the ledger is written in losses that cannot be undone. The wild bee-run steelhead run, once 43,200 strong, has collapsed by 99.9%. Fewer than 400 wild adults now return to the entire Clearwater Basin. The dam erased 1,667 miles of spawning habitat, drowned the heart of Nez Perce fishing country, and left the tribe fighting in court for rights promised in 1855. In 1997, the Snake River Basin steelhead was listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. Hatcheries release millions of juveniles each year, but the wild run remains a shadow of its former self, its future uncertain. Governor Cecil Andrus, at the dam's dedication in 1973, called Dworshak a monument to progress. Years later, he reflected that we gained flood control and power, but at a price we cannot begin to measure. The numbers add up, but the balance is uneasy. Some debts, ecological, cultural, spiritual, cannot be repaid. Today, wild bee-run steelhead remain functionally extinct above Dworshak's 717-foot wall. Hatcheries can't replace what once ran free, nor can they restore 1,667 miles of lost habitat or erase treaty rights. The choice to sever a river echoes forward, shaping every debate about what we value and what we're willing to lose.